Friends, we're exploring the Sicha of Kedoshim number 4 in volume 17 in Likutei Sichas. This is a deep halachic Sicha where the Rebbe endeavors to uncover how there can be laws and mitzvah obligations on a child. Particularly in the Sicha, he's doing this according to the opinion of the Rambam, who seems to hold clearly in numerous places that a child holds a legal halachic obligation. How can that be? He's a kid. To be sure, there are a few sichas, well-known sichas in Likutei Sichas that deal with this. Some of them deal with it a little bit differently. This is a fantastic sicha. To be sure, also, the scholars will take the sicha apart, every footnote, every line. Even the sicha itself has a lot. My job and my goal here is to give you the forest rather than the trees, so that someone sees the layout of the Sicha, the Rebbe's premises and approach, and then final conclusion, so to speak. And then if you want more, you want to learn it more deeper with other teachers or on your own. The Sicha, this scholarly treatise, if you will, treatise, is rooted in this week's portion because of a discussion of a child, a minor, who has relations with what's called a Shifcha Harufa. Shifcha Harufa means a maidservant who is half maidservant and half free. We know when they free, they become fully Jewish. How is she half and half? Because she has one owner freed her and the second owner didn't. And it's a problematic situation. And she has unique laws. And one of those laws is that and she's now betrothed to a Jewish servant who's the only person she's allowed to legally marry. And if during that time of betrothal, she has relations with another person, she gets lashes. The other person brings a sacrifice, which is also unique, apparently. Usually if there's relations, both of them get similar punishment. Here, she gets lashes and the other person gets a sacrifice. Maimonides rules, Rambam rules, that even if that person is a minor, as long as they're 9 years old and above, which means that intimacy is possible, then they are culpable to bring that sacrifice. She gets the lashes, they get the sacrifice. And the obvious question is, how could a minor be culpable? So that's where the springboard of this Sicha comes from today's portion. And there's a lot of discussion and commentary about this case itself. Some want to say that the minor is not really culpable of sin. You can't say that a minor sinned. The sacrifice, even though it's called carbon asham, which is a form of sin offering, is not really to atone. It's not really because of sin and punishment, but because of atonement and cleansing. But the Rebbe says there's only place for atonement and cleansing if there was sin. So again, the question returns back, how can there be culpability for a minor? Other sources say that it's derived from an extra letter in the Torah. It says a man will have relations, and the man, the vav includes even if he's a minor over the age of 9. So the Rebbe says, but we don't want to accept that this is just a decree without any logic, unless we have no other choice. It's much sweeter to find logic. We don't find a similar thing by any other illicit relationships where a minor has culpability. So that is the opening. And the takeaway, again, my goal here is to keep it simple. The takeaway question is, how can there be culpability by a minor? And we see it clearly in Rambam that there is. This kid has got to bring a sacrifice. I'm going to open the screen, and the Rebbe is going to present 3 cases where we see such a thing in law, in Rambam, where we have culpability by a minor, and which doesn't answer the question. It further expands the question. But that helps us lay the groundwork for the Rebbe's explanation, and then a deeper explanation. And then we'll revert back to explain all these 3 cases. That's going to be the makeup of the Sicha. We have the 3 cases. We're going to give an explanation. The Rebbe is going to say, it's not quite it. We're going to go deeper. And the Rebbe is going to be satisfied with that explanation, and then circle back to explain and apply that explanation to these 3 cases that we're now going to present, and ultimately to the case, the opening case of the Shifcha Harufa. So let's bring up a spreadsheet so we have clarity in front of us. So this is, I apologize that I'm a little slow here today. It's a little early in the morning. Okay. So this is the top of the screen. Rambam says a minor has relations with a half-freed maidservant. She gets lashed and he gets to bring an offering. How can they build culpability by a minor? That's the headline of the Sicha. Says the Rabbi. There are examples of a child's mitzvah obligation. I believe throughout this Sicha he's pretty much quoting Maimonides, Rambam. Even though on some of these things, others agree as well. Korban Pesach, paschal sacrifice. A child who comes of age between the first and second Pesach has to bring the second Pesach. This is a quote from Rambam, unless the first Pesach was already brought on his behalf. Just to step back for a second. So we know that the person missed bringing the first sacrifice on Pesach. They have a makeover, Pesach Sheni a month later. There's a whole discussion in halacha, separate and apart from the Sicha. What if somebody became of age or converted to Judaism in between those 2 dates? Do they not need to bring the second Paschal lamb? According to some thought processes, they missed the first one. They weren't Jewish or they weren't a majority age. And the first Pesach, they don't need to make a makeup for what? But according to halacha, the halacha is, and according to Rambam, that the second Pesach stands on its own. And even if I was not obligated to bring the first Pesach because I wasn't Jewish yet, or in this case, I was a minor, I became bar mitzvah sometime during the Omer days. When the second Pesach comes around, I need to bring the second Pesach. Says Rambam, however, unless the family already brought the first Pesach on his behalf. The way it would work is you would bring a Paschal lamb for a family or a few families, and you would pretty much list, so to speak, who is included, because there's not supposed to be any leftover, and there has to be enough for everyone to eat the right amount. And therefore, who is included? And this child was already included, so to speak, in a carbon that was brought the first month. So he was already spoken for, and therefore he's exempt. This is a big question, and this is a big discussion and commentary. How can there be such a thing? He's a kid. He's a kid. So because they brought a Paschal lamb on his behalf in the first Pesach, now he's going to be exempt from it when he's an adult? What he did before is kid stuff. It doesn't count. He had no obligation. You can't say, well, his obligation has been exempted. He didn't have an obligation. So how is that bringing it on his behalf counted as if he did it? Fantastic question. The Rebbe brings down Rikurkus, one of the great commentaries of all the original Rishonim, that translates it, that says that because he was counted on it, and the Torah allows him, the Torah specifically says that every member of the family can be included and counted as part of the eaters, and therefore it could exempt him. But how do you explain that? He was a kid. Next example, Torah study, quote Rambam, father is obligated to teach, typo, to teach his son Torah. However, if the father has not done so, the son is obligated to teach himself as soon as he is discerning. It's a mitzvah on the father to teach a child Torah. However, let's say the father didn't do it. The son has an obligation to teach himself Torah. When? As soon as he is discerning. Tzemach Tzedek writes, says the Rebbe, that Rambam could have said as soon as he comes of age, as soon as he becomes a gadol, a bar mitzvah, majority age. Now he's an adult and responsible for his own mitzvahs. He has to recognize I wasn't taught Torah. Torah study is a tremendous mitzvah. I better teach myself. We find that many times over. People, for example, the parents did not do a pidyon ben, they have to do it. The parent didn't do a bris, they have to do it. But when does that obligation kick in? It kicks in when they become bar mitzvah. Rambam doesn't say that, points out that Tzemach Tzedek. He doesn't say he has to teach himself when he becomes an adult. He says when he is discerning, meaning as soon as he realizes of the lack, he needs to teach himself, which means there is an obligation on him as a minor to study Torah. Again, the same question. How can there be any obligation by a minor? The key question of the Sicha is very straightforward. It's the same line from right up here. This is going to be the entire Sicha. How could there be culpability, responsibility, mitzvah by a minor? Third example the Rabbi gives, mitzvah training, chinuch. It's a mitzvah, it's a rabbinic mitzvah to educate our children, not just in Torah study, which is a biblical mitzvah, but in training of mitzvahs. You got to for the kid tzitzis, so he knows what tzitzis are. You got to teach him about a sukkah and about a lulav, about the laws of kosher, about brachas and benching and saying the Shema. All these things, we don't wait till they come by mitzvah and say, oh, let me tell you about Judaism, because it's a little late. You have a mitzvah, a rabbinic mitzvah of chinuch, of educating, which really means to train them to do mitzvahs so that when they come of age, they know what to do. This is a rabbinic mitzvah. So for all practical mitzvahs, for all practical purposes, it's a mitzvah, it's an obligation on the Jew. There's a question and there's a debate among sages. Is that obligation squarely on the father? Or is there also an obligation on the child? Is it just that the father has an obligation to educate the child? Or is it an obligation for the child to become educated? So that when the child realizes he wasn't educated, maybe he has to educate himself. Does he have any form of obligation, or he's just sitting there and dad has the obligation? It's a debate. Many of the sages say it's all about dad. He's a kid. How can you obligate him? However, some, and we're going to see Rambam goes into this latter category, says no. There is sort of an obligation on the child itself. Now, what would be the difference between these two sides? The bottom line is the same. The dad's going to get him tzitzis and he's going to wear them. The dad is going to teach him how to say Shema and he's going to say it. The dad is going to get him a lulav and he'll shake it. What is the difference? Who is the obligation? So there's a practical halachic difference, which makes this very interesting. And that is, let's say they're eating together. Can the child say the brachas, the benching, the grace after meal, to exempt the father? We know there's a principle that one Jew can exempt another Jew from a mitzvah. Like you can make kiddush for your whole family, and you can blow shofar for other people and exempt them. But that's only the case if the person who's blowing the shofar or making the kiddush has the same level of obligation as them. So, for example, a man can blow shofar for women. A woman, I guess, can blow shofar for women. A woman cannot blow shofar for a man because a woman doesn't have the biblical obligation of shofar blowing because it's a time-honored thing, and therefore she cannot exempt someone who has the full obligation. So now let's translate to this case. If I'm saying the grace and another person is there and hears it, maybe because they don't know how to say it themselves, or the custom of old was that people would just hear it from the main reader, people didn't have prayer books, and they would be exempted by them. So if the person who's benching has the biblical obligation to bench, they're an adult, they can exempt everyone at the table, not an issue. But what if the person is a child, and his father or his mother, they both have a biblical obligation to bench, are sitting at the table, they just finished eating, but they don't know how to bench. Rambam says it's a shanda that your child has to bench for you and your wife has to bench for you, but it happens. So what happens now? Could the child exempt the father or not? Now, if the child has a mitzvah obligation, remember it's rabbinic. It's a rabbinic obligation to educate, to train a child. If that obligation is on the child, then the child has a real obligation, albeit rabbinic. So if his father has a rabbinic obligation to bench, and how could that be? Benching is a biblical obligation. Yes, but only if you're completely satisfied. You eat, you'll be satisfied, and you'll bench. But if you ate less than fully satisfied, but you ate the amount of an olive, then you have to bench rabbinically. So in this case, if we say that there is an obligation of training, of chinuch, on a child rabbinically, and the father didn't eat enough to be satisfied, say his obligation for benching is rabbinic, so they're on the same level, the child can exempt the father. The child has a mitzvah rabbinic, the father has a mitzvah rabbinic. But if we hold like some of the other commentaries that hold that no, there's no such thing as an obligation on the child. It's completely on the father. The father has to educate the child and train the child to bench. The kid, he has no mitzvahs, he's a kid. So then the kid cannot exempt the father because he has no responsibility, he has no mitzvah. And you cannot exempt someone else if you don't have the mitzvah at least on the same level as that other person. So it becomes a clear difference in halacha. We see clearly that Rambam holds in many cases that there is a concept of obligation on a child to do mitzvahs for the sake of training. First of all, in this case of benching, Rambam clearly states that if the father did not eat enough to be biblically obliged to bench, the child can exempt him. So clearly you see that he holds that the child does have an obligation, a mitzvah obligation to bench. That's number one. But also, if you look at Rambam, As I'm enumerating on the list, on the screen, you see numerous cases. Rambam says that when he speaks about the laws of blessings, we have to train a child to blessings. The child has an obligation. Doesn't just say we have to train him. The child has a chiyuv, the language is used, an obligation to bench in order to train him. The child has an obligation to wear tzitzis in order to train him in that mitzvah. The child has an obligation for a sukkah, an obligation to shake a lulav as soon as he's old enough, as soon as he doesn't need his mother, as soon as he's old enough to understand it, etc. And Rambam clearly uses that language as opposed to other opinions, clearly stating there is a chiyuv, an obligation on the child, not just on the father to train the child, but on the child. So again, we see where Rambam is going. Rambam seems to be leaning in a direction that Rabbi apparently loves this direction, I think. He likes to have every Jew have a mitzvah, that the child has a real obligation. How can it be? What's the logic? According to Torah, children have no obligations. They're kids. So these are the three examples the Rebbe brings where we see that Rambam holds that there is an obligation on a child, but we don't have any explanation. We just have questions. We just have questions. How could this be? We have one question, really. You know, complicated Sicha like this, it's good to keep it simple, at least until the outset, till you get it, then you can try to complicate yourself. So the Rebbe presents an answer. The truth is the Rebbe presents it in a few stages. For the sake of clarity, I chose to present it as two different explanations. I think it's helpful that the Rebbe presents an explanation, and then the Rebbe isn't satisfied, and then there's going to be the deeper explanation. But the way it's presented in the Sicha, actually, it looks like one long explanation, but this is the understanding of what the Rebbe is doing, to my understanding. I think this is very helpful. So the Rebbe introduces, remember, any explanation the Rebbe gives has to have a basis and background in halacha, in Talmud. So the Rebbe says, we know that there's a concept of acts that are not a mitzvah, that are only a preparation for a mitzvah, a preliminary act before a mitzvah, that is elevated to the importance of a mitzvah. We also know that there can be people that assist in a mitzvah to another person, and their act can be elevated to a mitzvah. I put it on two columns. This is two different things that the Rebbe discusses here. But the headline of it is, as I'm writing, preliminary non-obligated acts or people are linked and thus elevated to the level of mitzvah importance. Remember, how is this related to us? We're trying to understand that here we have a father and a child. The father's educating the child. It makes sense. The father has an obligation. He's an adult. Somehow we want to say that the child, therefore, gets an obligation too, because he's part of the father's mitzvah. So that's where the Rebbe is going with this. That sometimes you can be an accessory. You can be a part of the, you can be helping a mitzvah, and you can count as a mitzvah. And we see this, first of all, most obviously, in one's own mitzvah. The preparation for the mitzvah sometimes is elevated to the mitzvah. And the examples on the left screen, that some hold that you can break, just like you can break Shabbos to do a bris, you can break Shabbos for the preparation of a bris. You forgot to bring the knife. You forgot to warm up the medicine that's needed. I don't believe this is halacha, but there's such an opinion. And some hold, this is from the Jerusalem Talmud, that we can make a blessing when we prepare the lulav, when we prepare the sukkah. Remember, the mitzvah is not to prepare it. The mitzvah is to sit in the sukkah and check the lulav. But the Jerusalem Talmud argues that we should make a bracha when we prepare the sukkah, lasso sukkah, to make a sukkah. Separate and apart from the mitzvah, leishe basukkah, to sit in the sukkah. The same thing is to make a lulav. So we see, so far we accomplished that there's an act which is just a preparation. It's not a mitzvah, but somehow it gets elevated to the level of mitzvah. That's if I myself are doing that act. Furthermore, what about if someone else is helping me? In a way, the other person is sort of a preparation or assist. That's the word I'm looking for, an assist in my mitzvah. And they too get reward. So for example, if a person supports one who studies Torah, they get reward. A woman doesn't have a mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. It's not her mitzvah, it's her husband's mitzvah. However, obviously he needs her to do it. And the halacha says that when she helps him do it, she also gets a mitzvah. So here we see examples where an act that's not a mitzvah is elevated to the level of a mitzvah because it's a preparation that's required. Similarly, a person assisting another in doing a mitzvah, which that person is not obligated in, their act is elevated as well to a mitzvah status. So says the Rebbe, apply this to a child's mitzvah obligation. Of course, a child can have an obligation. However, the father has the obligation to educate the child, and the child has to agree to be educated. So the child is an assist. The child is certainly a preparation to the mitzvah, and even more so an assist. The same way the woman, for example, gets a mitzvah. If she supports her husband's Torah study, the Rebbe also brings that down on her children, even though she doesn't have that mitzvah directly on her, unless it's certain things, like laws that she has to know for her life, or learning Chassidus, the Rebbe says applies to a woman equal to a man. But just to learn Talmud, she doesn't have that obligation. If she supports her husband and her son, she gets reward. Or she supports her husband to give birth to children, which is clearly necessary, she gets a mitzvah. So we see that assisting a mitzvah gives you a mitzvah. So that may be one explanation, says the Rebbe, why Rambam can say over and over and over, a child gets an obligation of a mitzvah. As per all the cases we said before. Tzitzis, sukkah, lulav. Because without the child, the father can't do the mitzvah of educating the child. So that, we could stop here. That could be maybe an explanation. The Rebbe is not satisfied though. Because the Rebbe says that in all the examples that we gave now, the person who's helping or the preliminary acts are necessary, but not integral. I underlined it because that's the essence of it. So I have to build the sukkah in order to have a sukkah. But the building of the sukkah isn't the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. It's not an integral part of the mitzvah. Yes, I have to have a wife in order to have children, to do the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply. But that's not what the mitzvah is. The mitzvah is not about the wife. The mitzvah is about the baby. So the person is assisting. They get a mitzvah, but they're not getting the same mitzvah. No one says that when a woman helps her husband have children, she gets the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiplying. She gets a mitzvah. That's the language. Yesh la mitzvah. Maybe she gets the mitzvah of helping another Jew. I don't know. She doesn't get that mitzvah. She's not integral in that mitzvah, even though she is absolutely critical to that mitzvah. It's different. She's an assist. She's needed. And the truth is, even one who supports Torah is critical. Without them, there won't be any Torah, etc. All these examples, true, they are critically necessary. However, you can't say that they become part of that mitzvah. They get a mitzvah for helping another mitzvah happen. And it's spelled out in the Rambam's language. It doesn't say she gets the mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. She gets a mitzvah. Because where would she get the mitzvah of fruitful and multiply if it wasn't given to her? And here, in our examples, we say by the Korban Pesach, the child was included in the first Paschal. He's now exempted from the second Paschal. We don't say that he gets a mitzvah. He did a nice voluntary mitzvah. He gets the mitzvah exemption of Paschal to the extent that now that he's by mitzvah, he doesn't have to bring another one. How did that happen? And the same thing is the mitzvah of a child studying Torah. How does he get the obligation to study Torah? Because it's on mitzvah training, because his father has the mitzvah to train him and to teach him Torah. You could say he's assisting the father in his mitzvah, but you can't say that he gets the mitzvah of Torah study. But if you look at the language of Rambam, it states clearly that he has the mitzvah of studying Torah when he becomes discerning, not that he gets a mitzvah. He has that mitzvah and he has it in an obligation. And the same thing is mitzvah training. All the examples that Rambam brought before, sukkah, lulav, benching, blessings, tzitzis, Rambam used the language, he is obligated in those mitzvahs. Yes, for the purpose of education, but he is obligated. So therefore, this has to be even stronger than a preparation or an assist to someone else doing a mitzvah. This has to somehow be that they become integral to the mitzvah. So the Rebbe expands this further. The Rebbe expands this further, and the Rebbe gives a deeper explanation. Not satisfied with the fact that maybe the child mitzvah obligation is compared to a preparation for a mitzvah, because he's helping dad do his mitzvah, or an assist to a mitzvah, because he's helping dad do his mitzvah, like a supporter of Torah study, or like a woman who helps her husband have children. No, that's an assist. We're going to find in Torah that sometimes a person does a mitzvah that involves another, and that second person who doesn't have the obligation becomes part of the mitzvah obligation. Not becomes an assist, becomes part of the mitzvah obligation, so to speak, on par with the other. How can that be? So the Rebbe says that's going to be the case when the mitzvah is about them. I want to give an example, which to me is the easiest to understand. It's from another Sicha. In this Sicha, the Rebbe brings it in a footnote. And that is the mitzvah of Hakel. We're in a Hakel year. The mitzvah is that all people, men, women, and children have to gather in Jerusalem on the 8th year. The Rebbe has a discussion in that Sicha, the language of the Torah and Rambam is there's an obligation on men, women, and children, even little babies. How can there be an obligation on babies? And it clearly is. If the babies don't come, you don't have Hakel. There's no such thing as an obligation on babies. It's the same question of this Sicha. But talking about little babies. And the Rebbe there explains it slightly different, but again, I'm comfortable bringing it in here because the Rebbe does quote it in a footnote in this Sicha. The Rebbe says, I want you to think about it. It's true that no such thing as an obligation on a child or a baby, but the Torah says that the adults have to come and make a Hakel, a gathering of men, women, and children. So clearly, including babies. So clearly, those children are part of the mitzvah. You can't say that the children being there is an optional. They are the mitzvah. It's almost like saying, I have a mitzvah to put on tefillin. Is there an obligation on the tefillin? The tefillin are integral. They are the mitzvah. So the Rebbe wants to say that by Hakel, that the attendance of children is called obligatory, even though no one could put obligation on a child because they're not needed, they're not responsible. But they are the tefillin. They are the object of the mitzvah. They are the mitzvah. Realize how much more integral this connection is. When a woman even helps her husband have a child, she's critical. Without her, there's no child. But the mitzvah is not about her. The mitzvah is that there should be a child. She's absolutely needed. Similar and much more so perhaps than someone who's supporting of one who's studying Torah. It's needed. Without that person, you won't study Torah. Without the woman, you're not going to have a child. True, but you can't say that she has the same mitzvah. She has a mitzvah, as we said earlier. She's assisting him in doing his mitzvah. She gets a mitzvah. But how would she get that mitzvah? The mitzvah isn't her. The mitzvah is the baby should be born. But in the case of Hakel, I'm sticking to that example because once you get that, the rest of the list will be easy. The mitzvah is that he should bring his babies. So the babies are absolutely an obligation. Can't put it on them, but they carry the obligation of the dad. The mitzvah isn't a third thing should happen through their assistance. The mitzvah is that they should be there. So therefore, it's appropriate to say that there's an obligation on children to be there. Who carries that obligation? The adult. But the mitzvah obligation of the adult carries over to the child, so to speak. The Rebbe gives an example of two adults. We know it's a mitzvah for all males to show up 3 times a year pilgrimage in the temple and bring Shalom Simcha, joyous offerings of peace offerings which were eaten as meals. It was a whole Simcha. And I think this is the mitzvah of joy on the holidays. So the Rebbe brings down opinions that hold. There's a whole discussion, debate, Rashi, Tosfos. Again, I'm keeping it very simple. The Rebbe brings down that there's an opinion that holds that the man, the woman has to come. Also, the woman also has to come. She has a mitzvah of Simcha, of Shalom Simcha, of being there in the temple when they're celebrating in Jerusalem and eating this festive meal of joy. Why? She can't have a mitzvah tie on to mitzvah. Women are not obligated in the mitzvah of Shalom Simcha. There's very few time-honored mitzvahs that they have. However, her husband has a mitzvah of the simcha, which is done through the sacrifice. And part of that mitzvah is that he has to make sure his wife is joyous through the sacrifice, according to that opinion. And therefore, she's got to show up because she is the mitzvah. So it's not that he needs her in order to do a third mitzvah. He needs her because she's the mitzvah. The same way I need tefillin to do the mitzvah of tefillin. I need a child to do the mitzvah of hakel. I need the mitzvah. I need my wife in Jerusalem so that I can do the mitzvah of bringing her joy. Understand the brilliance. The Rebbe is pushing this envelope deeper, where a non-obligated person becomes integral to the mitzvah because the mitzvah is about them. The Rebbe brings in a footnote. I'm going down on my list here. That the halacha is that a person who lends money with interest is a non-kosher witness on grounds of being what's called in Torah eit chamas, a witness who robs, because interest without the proper system in place is considered robbing. And the Torah says, though, you shouldn't be a eit chamas, a robbing witness. And if you lend money on interest, you're considered a robber in Torah. You can't be a witness. You're not a kosher witness. What about if you didn't lend money on interest? You borrowed money on interest. You didn't rob. If anything, you were robbed. So the halacha is that you too are exempt, are not allowed, disqualified for being a witness on the grounds of being a robbing witness. But you didn't rob, you were robbed. It's true. You didn't rob, but you allowed someone else to rob. And not just in a way of an assist. Again, this is important. This is what the Sicha is, the two steps. Not just because you allowed yourself to borrow an interest, the other person did the sin. You're integral. You were the sin. And therefore, you carry the same culpability, so to speak. The Rabbi gives another example in footnotes, which is fascinating. There's a blessing on the Kohanim to bless. There's a mitzvah, obligation on the Kohen to bless the Jewish people. What about the Jewish people? Is there a mitzvah on them to be blessed? The Rebbe brings in a footnote from different sources that yes, they have a mitzvah to be blessed. It's not just an assist. It's not just since the Kohen has a mitzvah to bless Jews. No, he's got to have someone to bless. So if you show up and let yourself be blessed, you get a mitzvah. Like the woman who allows herself to help her husband have a child, she gets a mitzvah, but you don't get the mitzvah of the same mitzvah. Here, the mitzvah is that the Jews should be blessed by the Kohen. And if you show up to be blessed, you get that mitzvah of the Kohen blessing because you are the mitzvah. You're integral. You're not just necessary. And he brings in the footnotes that this is an actual mitzvah, quoting different halachic authorities. It's a mitzvah on the Jews to be blessed by the Kohen. Which is interesting, by the way. We can't miss that because it's not our job. It is our job. How can you say it's our job without a Kohen? Doesn't say B'tzivanu that we were commanded to be blessed. They were commanded to bless. It's true, but since they were commanded to bless you, so automatically you are the mitzvah. You got to show up. You have an obligation. You become part of that mitzvah, not just an assist to that mitzvah. Just like the example of the child who is needed for hakel, and therefore, in a way, he is obligated, even though the obligation, instruction is given to the parent. So now that we have this brilliant approach, let's apply it to our cases. We had the case of the Paschal. There it brings down from the Rugged Shaver that this law of Rambam, that the child is exempt from the second Pesach, only in the case that the first Pesach was brought on his behalf, and he wasn't just part of the family, but he was listed as apparently they would make a list, how many people are included and how much they can eat, because everyone had to have enough, and then there won't be any leftovers. So only when he was listed as an individual person, and the Torah allows for this. The Torah clearly states that we could count for each person, even a child. So since they become included in the mitzvah, and they ate part of the Paschal lamb of the adults, and it counts. We don't say that what the child ate doesn't count. Maybe that would be a sin. That means we're leaving over from the Paschal lamb. It counts. The Torah elevates them to the mitzvah level, not because the Torah puts obligation on the child. There's no such thing. But the Torah includes a child as part of the mitzvah object. Almost like the tefillin are the mitzvah for us to put. So therefore, now when the child was included, there's no need for the child to bring the second Paschal lamb. The child did it like an adult. because the child did have mitzvah obligation. They're elevated to the same level, so to speak, of the adult because they are integral. It's brilliant stuff. Obviously, this is a very big discussion, and a lot of commentaries will argue over this. This is big stuff. But obviously, we're just touching the surface. The same thing is the mitzvah of Torah study. There's a biblical mitzvah to teach a child Torah. And as brought down, Rambam says that if his father didn't teach him, he's obligated to teach himself as soon as he's discerning. And the Tzemach Tzedek points out that even if he's before the age of bar mitzvah, he is obligated to teach himself. How so? He's a child. The father's obligated to teach him. It's not about him, but it is about him. The father's obligated to teach him. And the same thing would be to all the mitzvahs of mitzvah training. The Torah or the sages obligate the father to teach the child, to train the child. So now whatever obligation is on the father, according to the Rebbe's thinking, sort of carries over to the child because the child is integral. It's not a mitzvah for the father to do something in the abstract. It's a mitzvah for the father to train this child, to teach this child. So the kid now, you can't give him obligation per se, but he carries an obligation to be educated. He carries an obligation to his Torah, even though, and whose obligation is the father's obligation, but it carries over to him because the object of the mitzvah is him. He is the mitzvah. His father has to do the mitzvah, but he is the mitzvah. So if my father is supposed to teach me Torah and he didn't, so now that father's obligation is still out there. So as soon as I recognize that, I should pick it up. I guess I'm obligated to pick it up. Brilliant stuff. Apply this thinking to the half-made servant case as well. I'm going to do this very briefly because it gets very complicated, but basically the half-made servant who has relations with someone who's not supposed to, it's different than all other unkosher relations where there's a sin squarely on both. And in most cases, it's an equal sin on both. And in most cases, the punishment is the same for both. And each of them has their own sin. He's a sinner, she's a sinner. In the maidservant case, apparently the sinner is the maidservant. It's not such a grave sin on the other person, apparently. The sin on the other person is only because he facilitated her sin. Very much like the conversation here. The child who's facilitating the father's mitzvah. And therefore, that other person brings a sacrifice, a sin offering, so to speak, for allowing the other person to sin. They don't get the lashes. For whatever reason, it's different than all other unkosher relationships. And therefore, since it's only you're being sort of an assist, and more than an assist, as the Rebbe carried us through this whole process, but you're actually integral to her sin. So even if you're a child, you're elevated now to the adult level, in this case, to bring a sacrifice. I want to just conclude with the lessons the Rebbe talks about. The Rebbe says that this brings out the importance of the mitzvah of chinuch, of educating children, especially now between Pesach and Shavuos. And both holidays are very much about education, right? Pesach is the Haggadah of V'higadah Lebincha, tell it to your children. Shavuos is when God gave us a Torah and taught us we're his children, and he gave us a Torah only because we put up our children as guarantors. So we see very much an emphasis during this time of year for education. And obviously it's a big deal by the Rebbe, education. You might say the most important mitzvah in the sense of the Rebbe push, we should teach Jews and teach children. Even if they're not children, if they're not our children, there's a mitzvah to teach all Jews Torah. This is a big deal. But I think there's something here that the Rebbe is bringing home. Think about how the Rebbe stood by rallies when little children sang Teirat Tziva and Shema Yisrael. What's the value in that? If it's just education, it's a rabbinic mitzvah. I mean, the Rebbe is giving his time so that a child should say Shema. When a child says Shema, they didn't do anything. They're a child. It's like a person who's not obligated to do a mitzvah, doing something. It's very nice, but he can't say it's really important. The value, before this Sicha, without this Sicha, understand, the value of a child shaking a lulav, sitting in a sukkah, saying Shema, putting on tzitzis, davening. There's no real value. The adult is getting a mitzvah. The father, whoever's responsible for that child. But when the child says Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, nothing really happened. Whereas a real mitzvah, this is divine presence. I believe the Rebbe is saying this in the end of the Sicha when the Rebbe gives the lesson. The lessons are always written in simple language, but if you think about it a little, you realize it's a bombshell, just like the rest of the Sicha. No, it's an obligation for a father and every year to teach a child Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. But that obligation now carries over to the child because the child is an integral part of the mitzvah. Just like the tefillin are integral to my tefillin. The child is a mitzvah. So when a child does a mitzvah, a child says Shema Yisrael, there's nothing lacking here. This is an absolutely 100% bona fide mitzvah with all of the trimmings of kedusha, holiness, and divinity that a mitzvah is. It's huge because it's about them. Just going to add, this is already a little bit, this is not in the Sicha, but perhaps this is also a takeaway from the Sicha. What's the point of the Sicha? That even a person who you're teaching, who's not obligated on their own, being that it's about them, then they get the obligation. But think about those words, it's about them. The Rebbe says in the end of the Sicha that the mitzvah of chinuch is not just to your children, but to any Jew. We're Lubavitcher Chassidim, we're always teaching other Jews. Let's remember it's about them. There's a right way to do outreach and a wrong way. The wrong way, not the Rebbe's way, is it's about me. Since I have a mitzvah to do outreach, where does it say in the Talmud? Teach it to your children. That represents your students. If you meet any Jew who doesn't know about Torah, they can be a child, they can be a child in age, a child in knowledge. You have a mitzvah to teach them. And since you want to do that mitzvah, so you're going to go, you're going to do outreach because you want to be a good Jew. But not so much about them. We know it doesn't work. People smell that it's selfish. They're not interested. Leave me alone because you want to get points or you want to do your obligation. I got to stop in the middle of the street and put on tefillin, or I got to start studying Torah. Bother somebody else for your problems, for your mitzvahs. The successful and the meaningful and the real way of outreach is that you do it because it's about them. And I believe humbly that that's one of the takeaways at the end of the Sicha, and the Sicha brings it home in a halachic way. When you talk to a child, when you talk to an adult, child in knowledge, or another yid, they may know more than you, but in this particular subject, they may not know. And you're inspiring them and you get them to do a mitzvah. Remember what you're doing. It's all about them. They are the mitzvah. It's not you. And you speak with a different love, a different respect, and you get different results.